There we go. So the recording has now started. So firstly, I'd just like to thank everyone who has just joined the call. This is the second Risk Officer Sustainability Forum discussion, webinar discussion. The format for those people that are unclear is that Alex Hindson and Alex Duncan are the co-chairs for the Risk Officer Sustainability I can't even say that. We've got to change the name. Sustainability Forum. The structure of the forum is that we hold a roundtable discussion of around 12 to 15 senior chief risk officers, Chatham House rule, and then a few weeks later we repeat the discussion, but it's a panel discussion, open access, public access, and that's what this is. So this is a public access webinar. We are recording, so if you are uncomfortable with being recorded, then I'm afraid you'll probably need to drop off the call. So I'd just like to introduce our panelists. To start with, we have Alex Hindson, who is Chief Risk and Sustainability Officer at Argo and a co-chair for the Risk Officer Sustainability Forum. We have Keith Davies, who I noticed on LinkedIn has changed his title now. Have I got that right? It says on LinkedIn you're Chief Risk and Compliance Officer at Federated Hermes.
Yeah, it's strange. Yes, I am.
Right, okay, because you had a different description last time, so you've obviously resprayed yourself, right? And we have Susan Young, who is Chief Risk Officer at Randall and Quilter. You can go and look up more details about their CVs on LinkedIn. I suspect they're all quite happy to connect if you'd like to send an invite. And we won't, perfect. We won't spend more time on the introductions than that. So the question for the webinar today is sustainability regulation a neglected area of emerging risk? We have some slides, which I will put on screen briefly. These were used in the roundtable discussion. I won't keep them up on the screen too long because they do dominate the screen and you can't see the happy smiling faces otherwise. So the four areas that we discussed at the roundtable were the sustainability landscape, governance and decision making, supply chain and third-party risks, and data and reporting. And what we will do in this webinar is that we will go through sustainability landscape, governance, data and reporting as topic areas for discussion, and we'll bring in the supply chain aspects as and when we feel those are appropriate. So I'll just take that off the screen and we can share those slides with people afterwards anyway, if they're interested. As you saw, they were fairly brief. So Alex, I think we're going to come to you first, if that's okay. So you're talking about the landscape, the sustainability landscape. If you can just give us a couple of thoughts and then we'll open up to a panel discussion.
Oh, that's fine. So as you heard, I'm playing tag with Alex Duncan on running this group with Chris's support, and Alex did actually do a blog of the roundtable discussion, which is available on the Risk Coalition website. So just to get started, you know what, I'm just going to quote from some of the notes from the roundtable that are in the blog, just to give you a scale problem. That anecdotally, even in a single country on a single topic, such as investments, it's difficult to keep the list of regulations to a single page in terms of ESG developments. And I think the takeaway from the roundtable that it's actually an overwhelmingly difficult task just to monitor what you're meant to be doing, never mind actually get organised about doing it. So I think in the run up to COP26, I personally actually kind of decided I'll wait and see what happens and reconnect with all this after COP26 because there's just too much. Just a couple of sample data points. The Climate Financial Risk Forum, which is a UK body that is supported by the PRA and the FCA, and puts out guidance, and we all know what guidance means in a regulatory context. They put out 10 documents last week on Thursday, which are over 300 pages, and I'm sure they're very helpful, but it takes a little while to read them. And ironically, that report pointed out, the bit that I did read, it pointed out an explosion of reporting requirements, identifying 20 new UK and EU requirements, excluding inverted commas voluntary reporting. And I think the other example I'd give you is that Lloyd's put out, those of us that have an involvement in Lloyd's of London, they put out ESG guidance last week on the same day. So it was clearly coordinated. So I think the other thing that I reflect on last week is even AXA got into trouble last week with activist shareholders for not doing enough. So people who put themselves up as market leaders and clearly have a lot of resources and you would assume are on top of working out what is expected of them can still get caught out. So I think, how do organizations keep track of all this, and how do they prioritize? And I think my observation is, it really goes back to how do you set an ESG strategy, which is you have to decide, you have to kind of work out who your key stakeholders are. And I would say this, as a risk manager, you have to do a threat and opportunity assessment, and you have to kind of rank things, and you're going to have to do two things out of that. You're going to have to pick out the highs that are urgent and non-negotiable, and then you're going to have to make a long list of the nice to haves or the maybes that you'll get to sometime. But you give yourself permission not to do some of this, because otherwise I think the danger is it is overwhelming. You end up like a rabbit in the headlights and you achieve nothing. So my argument would be, prioritize, justify, get your board and executive on board with the choices you've had to make, and then you're going to have to revisit, readjust, and just do your best.
I was going to ask that question. You'd actually share your analysis with your board risk committee, with your board, to get their buy-in for the decision.
I think otherwise it's whoever makes that call is quite personally risky, because it's a risk assessment. It could be wrong. You may call it wrong, but I think not doing a risk assessment is worse, because you try and do everything, you spread yourself too thin. So I'll let the other two kind of jump in and tell me where I got that wrong.
Susan, do you have any comments, Susan?
Hi. Well, as usual, I agree with everything that Alex.
Please don't do that.
No, I do. I mean, I agree with everything that he said, and when I come on to talk a bit about governance, I'll expand on my views on that. But but without wanting to preempt what I'm going to say into too much. But I think that there is about this barrage of reporting requirements, and my view is that that's just a manifestation of the fact that regulators are also finding their way with this. We've seen it with GDPR, we've seen it with Solvency II. There's an element of the blind leading the blind, really. And my hope is that in due course, whenever that is, it will settle down a bit. And I also totally agree with the fact that it is a risk assessment. I mean, we're going through this process ourselves at the moment. You've got to identify what's important to you as an organisation, so you're in a position to be able to lead the board. So you need to pull them rather than push them with all of this stuff. So yeah, completely agree with everything that Alex is saying, but I will certainly expand on that when I come to do my overview.
Okay, Keith, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree with the thing with a couple of additions. I think candidly, it is part of strategy. Determining what you wish to aim for should be the way round, and then you report on some of that, potentially some additional things you just have to do for regulatory. And therefore, it is very much a board discussion, and it cannot be just an ESG strategy. That the problem that I think firms are increasingly getting is ESG is contradictory to commercial strategy sometimes. You could have a situation where you focus on prioritising certain sectors of the workforce, but that comes at a cost and various other things that need to be factored in. So I think it's very much part of the strategy rather than a separate standalone strategy. I'm speaking, there's a couple of firms that are further advanced on that. I think that they're almost differentiating between the metrics or the values that they actually want, a shortlist, as everyone said, of what they really stand for and want to do. And that's what drives their strategic annual reporting and internal reporting and behaviours. But you may also have to do a load of stuff to keep regulators happy, which becomes just a submission that if people want to get it, they can get it. So I think we're going to see a differentiation over time between those you have to do and those you want to do. But we're at that horrible situation in between where I think what Susan said, well, it's the blind leading the blind. We don't know which ones are which yet. And that's where the boards have to be strong. We have to, Alex said absolutely bang on, we have to be prepared not to do certain things. So fully agree. I think it's just, as I say, the only bit to add is it's got to be part of the commercial strategy or the overall strategy of the firm. Otherwise, you end up skewing certain things that are flavour of the month.
And are you finding that boards are sufficiently strategic in their thinking, or are they a little bit reactive, kind of flip-flopping, to use one of Brian's favourite phrases?
Yeah. No.
In terms of what's coming out, and also the pressure from external stakeholders, pressure groups even. How are you finding there?
I think it is reactive. It's reactive, but people realise they've got to be proactive, not just because they can't do everything, but actually you've got to get ahead of the problems. I think Black Lives Matter was a really interesting one last year. Of course, it's an absolute priority for every firm, but I think people were caught on the hoof and had to make up positions and statements and targets. Whereas if you think about it, that should be whatever the next one of those is that hits the headlines, you should already be having, if it's going to be that important, and it is that important both to firms and society, you should already be thinking that. So I think people are now starting to think ahead as opposed to reacting, but it's still in that twilight zone where something could pop up tomorrow and take disproportionate focus, and you've got to run around and sort that out as a fire as opposed to a strategic thinking piece.
And how do you identify the next big thing?
Well, I think if you've got a decent kind of emerging risk process, it's all out there. It's whether you can spot the signals, because we can see that the next issue that's going to come up from a reporting point of view, if you kind of just think about it, is we're going to be expected to report on the number of people with ethnic minorities in management and the ethnic pay gap, and then it's going to be looking at economic disadvantage and how you're addressing that. So it's not as if we're not seeing the questions come up in the same way as we're all trying to deal with climate, but the policymakers and the thought leaders are now already moved on to biodiversity loss. So the challenge the challenge is it's all out there to be found. It's just that there's so much of it that it's hard to pick the winners. In terms of which one is going to emerge first. And so that's why I think, in essence, you've this kind of horizon scanning or risk assessment is not something you do once and you put on the shelf. You have to keep on coming back to it and saying, is our ranking moving, and do we need to be nimble? That's quite difficult.
Okay, Susan.
Yeah, I was just going to add something. I think it's all about us leading the charge in helping the board shift its mindset around all of this stuff, really, because just to the points that have already been made, unless we do that, then we're not going to be able to be picking up on the latest sort of flavour of the month in this regard. So, but I think we have to lead the charge, really. Otherwise, I think there's a risk it might get lost in translation. But I don't think this is going to happen overnight. It is a process. It's going to take years, I think.
So you think that the CRO and the risk function has a role in helping the board focus on what really matters, sorting the wheat from the chaff in terms of prioritization?
I think so, but I think it also has to be a multidisciplinary approach as well. That's certainly the way that we're coming at it in our organisation.
Okay.
Chris, can I?
Yes.
Can I jump at that? I agree. It is multidisciplinary, and this is where it is a slightly different beast. These sort of, what are they, transversal or pervasive risks are slightly different to things we've dealt with before. So when things like Alex's emerging risk register, yes, but we need to make sure they cover all the types of risk. And this is where I think the role of the risk officer needs to be clearly defined, right? Because candidly, wherever I've worked, it's to protect the long-term value of the company, and that now includes all these non-financial, non-traditional metrics that we'd probably previously never thought of. So absolutely, Susan's bang on. It is us pooling the talent and resources around, but it is a risk, right? This is a risk to not achieving full potential, and as Alex said, massive reputational risk if you don't, almost existential if you don't deliver some of the table stakes. So I think it very much is in the chief risk officer, and I think Alex has set the trend: chief risk and sustainability officer, chief trust officer. These are all going to become new titles, I think, because of that.
Okay. I'd like to move on to the next question, which is with Susan, which is on governance and decision making. So, Susan, same format. I'll let you do a couple of minutes just introducing the topic, any main thoughts, and then we'll open up to the other panel members.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. My observations are both generic in terms of the subject matter of the discussion forum as a whole, and also specific towards governance and decision making. So I think I'll start by just saying that I don't think sustainability is a neglected area of emerging risks, but I'll just reiterate what I said a moment ago, is that I do think that regulators are also finding their way with this, and which is why we're seeing this in a barrage of reporting requirements, and we're finding ourselves in a position where we're having to sort the wheat from the chaff. I think we're all in the same boat with this. As I said earlier, we saw it with Solvency II, we've seen it with GDPR, we've seen it with lots of different regulatory initiatives, if you will. And dare I say it, climate change. That we know that that's a risk in its own right, and that's been around a lot longer than ESG as a concept. So I think in terms of board understanding, I believe from my own experience that they know it's important, but there's so much so-called thought leadership out there. They need a steer to cut through it all, and it is the risk officer's role and the multidisciplinary function, whatever form that takes. We need to sort of lead the charge to guide them all in determining what things in the ESG landscape are important to them, and that's all the stuff that Alex alluded to earlier. And then from that, the framework for decision making can be developed around that. So otherwise, if we try to clutch at too many straws, we're never going to get anywhere, and that's certainly what I'm finding. I think the risks in this context, they're not just, I think we have to have regard to the fact that they're not just downsides if we don't get it right. There's lots of opportunity out there if we do get it right. And I think board members, in order to make proper decisions and informed decisions, need to be aware of the opportunities that also exist in the ESG space as well. But until we determine what's important to us, we're limited in really what we can do. I think just focusing on climate change as a subset, I think what I'm finding, because we've got a lot of different regulators as stakeholders, we're getting a lot of data calls from various regulators, and they're taking lots of different forms. Some of them are qualitative, some of them are quantitative. And we're having to be very reactive in terms of the way that we respond to those. And I think there's a risk there that we might not be giving a consistent message if we don't have a consistent approach to dealing with all of these. I'm hopeful that this will all settle down in due course. In terms of signing off public statements, I think that inevitably has to be somebody on the board. I think the size of the company will determine whether or not there's a separate ESG committee as a committee of the board. And I think that seems to be from my perspective that's the direction of travel. But we have to have regard to proportionality. But I don't see that it can really sit anywhere else. In terms of membership and compliance costs, I think it's really just too early to say. I think this requirement is evolving, but I think that what's clear at this stage is that is good recognition of ESG, and if we're seen to be good, then obviously that will have positive ramifications for us. And so I think in the conclusion, can I just finish? In conclusion, I think we're still finding our feet with this, but I think there's an opportunity to pull rather than push our boards to facilitate what decision making they need to engage in, really.
Okay.
There's still a lot of risk and uncertainty.
I was going to ask, in terms of obviously you don't go into the details, but in terms of the board discussions that you're witness to and the board risk committee discussions, is ESG, sustainability, climate change, all those things, are these being seen as, is the organisation taking a defensive approach to this? Oh gosh, we need to do this. It's this license to operate. It's expensive, but we have to do it. Or are they seeing it opportunistically as we can differentiate, we can steal a march on our competitors, we can actually generate returns from this? I mean, there was a report from Oxford University a week or two ago which showed that over the next few decades, the green revolution is actually going to generate trillions in returns because of the transformation of the economy, and organizations should really be viewing it in that context. How is it being seen at the moment? Is it defensive or is it opportunistic, and we can make the most of this?
I think it's somewhere in the middle of the spectrum, to be honest. But I think that's because it all goes back to us, taking the opportunity to lead our boards. I mean, when this all started, I think there was a groundswell of opinion that this was all down to the oil and gas companies and all of these organisations which have large carbon emissions, but clearly it's being seen as much broader than that now. So I think, to answer the question, I think we're somewhere in the middle at the moment, but that's not because the board don't want to engage with it. It's just because they're still on the educational continuum, if you will.
Okay. And Alex,
does that make sense?
It's an important point. I mean, I think for the board to actually be able to have a view, and bear in mind, a board isn't a single person. It's a disparate number of people, different backgrounds, who also sit on other boards and get different input from those boards. The first thing is to get a commons awareness, and certainly we've done a couple of things that have been quite helpful. One, not to take away collective responsibility, but we've got an ESG sponsor at board level, and that helps because that person is investing a little bit more time in understanding it, but they've actually found that it's helpful to them on multiple boards, and so it's a good thing. We've also provided external input to the board on ESG matters and had people present different aspects, climate, but also just broad ESG and from a shareholder perspective. So what are the trends and what do shareholders expect as being one of the important stakeholder groups? I think, having done the stakeholder analysis, probably our two most important stakeholder groups are investors and staff. And I don't think we should underestimate staff. The upside here is to do with talent attraction and retention, and not just the diversity and inclusion policies, which are obviously important, and all the health and well-being that flows out of COVID, but the wider aspects of the environment and governance are pertinent to: do I want to work for this company? Is this a place that makes me proud to come into work? So I think there is a upside, but inevitably the danger is that the more mandatory reporting and the more things have to be signed off by the board or external auditors, that the more you'll kind of be held back by what has to be done. So I actually think boards want to find a positive because it's a lot of effort, and if there isn't a positive, it just becomes another tick box exercise. But are we going to be allowed to?
Okay, Keith, do you want to come in?
And actually, that's a. I just wanted to. Can I just make a point first?
Of course.
I think the thing that Alex has just said about the tick box exercise, I think is really important, because try as we might, we cannot make this into a tick box exercise. Even if we tried our utmost, it just can't happen. Even if you wanted to, it can't be a tick box exercise.
Well, it's interesting because I was just say, just bringing the supply chain aspects. What we are hearing is that organizations are looking at their supply chain and they're asking really challenging, difficult questions of their supply chain, and people are making decisions as to who they use, partly on the basis of that supply chain. How green is your supply chain? Because everyone's needing to address this. So I think you're right. It needs to be taken seriously, and it cannot just be kind of greenwashing a tick box. So it's Keith. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think again, just summarising, probably more than saying anything different. It's linked to your preparedness, I think, and where firms are in terms of thinking about this and their values, whether it's reactive or forward-looking. I think where firms are behind the curve, it is reactive. They've got to do some TCFD reporting. They've got to do this. They've got to do that. It's seen as a burden and therefore a cost, without really having thought about what it means for opportunities. Those that are at the forefront do see it as an opportunity. Alex is bang on right. It's about attracting, retaining, motivating staff. I work in a company which specialises in ESG, so we attract a certain type of younger employee that wants their company to do certain things. We wouldn't get them if we didn't have it, and we'd lose them if we don't. The people that are first mover advantage on a number of products will gain a massive strategic opportunity, not just from that product, but being seen as leaders in that field. So I think that it actually, I think there's almost like a dichotomy of those. The believers will be seeing it definitely as an opportunity and capitalising on, and the laggards are sort of coming through and will see it as an opportunity. But then it actually becomes a question of authenticity. It's not just about determining a strategy and trying to do things. It's actually making sure you deliver it day after day, as otherwise that opportunity you get will become worse, because you won't just not achieve it, you'll actually jeopardize all the things you're trying to do, because people just won't buy into your brand or values. So I think it's a massive opportunity, and I think boards are getting there, but I think there is a real 2 or 3 tier system at the moment.
Interesting. I was on a call yesterday, and the discussion came up about hybrid working, people working from home, people being told to come back into the office. And the question was raised about, well, why is it that some of the American banks are insisting on people being back in the office, whereas others are happy with a hybrid model? Some even are actually moving to fully remote and just coming to the office as and when you absolutely need to. Does that reflect on? Do you think that reflects on the boards themselves in terms of how forward thinking they are, or is it what's behind that? Do you think? I know it's slightly it's more to do with the S of ESG, I guess.
Can I throw? I actually read.
Yeah, please. Excellent. That was good.
Yeah. So I think that there are a number of factors, right? That it's not just the S bit. There's the litigation. There's values of how you believe the firm operates best commercially, right? Let's be fair. That certain firms believe they work better in the office. There's the regulatory oversight piece that can be done better for certain jobs in the office than at home. So there's a number of factors. I think the bit where we got to, and this is what I say, is actually you've got to think your decision through and see what the future ESG situation is. So, for example, if you end up with a situation where you say it doesn't matter where you work, we will treat you equally, etc., etc. Well, then you've got to have a policy that allows people to be treated the same in the office as not, because otherwise you get what is sort of, what's it called now? The basically the bias, proximity bias. Basically, like head office always gets promoted ahead of home. And if you do that, one, that disenfranchises the workforce, but two, you may have certain socio-economic groups who prefer to work from home, whether that be females, young mothers, young fathers. disabled people or whatever, and you're prejudicing them and compromising your ESG piece. So I don't think ESG is the driver of the hybrid decision. I think whatever you do with your workplace decision, you need to consider the ESG implications. Can the office working in clean, energy efficient buildings with recycling, etc., versus everybody at home turning their lights on is another angle. It's a small one, but there's a lot of implications that need to be factored in. I don't think it's the driver, because as I say, any strategy has to consider commercial, operational, and sustainability, but you actually can't ignore the sustainability aspects when making that decision.
Yeah, well, I was just going to add that this whole issue of changing expectations of the workforce about remote versus office working, I think that was there anyway. Even before ESG came along. So the ESG, I suppose, imperative, coupled with the COVID-19 pandemic, all that has done is it's brought it to the fore. But it's been there for a long time. But I think some of these external sort of imperatives have just accelerated the need to do something about it. And it is horses for courses. Different organisations work in different ways. And arguably, it's not good for people. We take the stance that it's not good for people to be at home all of the time, but recognising that it's also good for well-being. It's getting the right balance. But it was there anyway. I think that's the point I was making. We've just been. It's just forced the issue. It's just forced the issue. Yeah.
Okay. Right. We're going to move on to our third and final topic now. So Keith, you're back in the spotlight. So if you'd like to
turn mute off.
No, keep mute on. That's much better. So if you'd like to walk us through data and reporting, that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably putting together a lot of the pieces, because the question is the data the end outcome, or is it something that helps you achieve a target, right? And I think that's sort of the basics. What data? So, I mean, candidly, if you look at any data, and I think Susan's use of use tests in Solvency II is really, it understands you where you stand. So there are reasons why you need data. You need to understand where you are, and therefore can you address it. It allows you to set targets to aim for those things you want to, and you need to incorporate, and this is the big bit, into relevant business decisions. You need to make sure it's factored, and those that are really important are probably the ones you then put into, I think the other piece was REM. You only want the really important ones to drive the REM and incentive pieces. Because candidly, if you put something into processes and REM, it drives the behaviours you want as well as other things. And candidly, if you don't put it into REM and processes, you're relying on people's goodwill that doesn't necessarily always come to the top. Another key point I think Alex made, it does allow you to stakeholders to what you're doing well and badly, and that includes internal stakeholders. So it's not just saying what the regulator wants. You need to report on those things that matter to your staff and other stakeholders. And I think a piece we were talking about, there's so much going on with regulation, disclosures, various social charters. It almost helps you keep track of what you've committed to and whether you're doing it, and making sure that some things aren't contradictory. When you make a decision, you weigh up all those different things. So I think data is really important in embedding the desired outcomes. But a few caveats, which are fairly obvious from what we said before. It is only a tool, right? It's not on its own going to drive anything. You have to have the genuine desire and culture to achieve whatever your ESG stance is. The data tells you how close you are if you're getting there, or you stay there, but it doesn't drive it itself. It can't, and on that, it can't be. It has to be aligned to the values of the company, because if it's not, you'll set targets or report data that isn't actually true. And you end up with this sort of greenwashing, reputational damage that can be particularly bad. We've said it before, it can't be a means to itself. Ticking a box does something and may become a cottage industry, but doesn't demonstrate any genuine approach or get you to the right place. You have to therefore, I think, distinguish between those you wish to report and action on and those you have to report. So that was the dichotomy I mentioned earlier. It has to be balanced. At the moment, I think there is so much emphasis on certain things. Even in the ESG world, it's skewing board behaviours, company activity to the expense of other things, including commercial, but other things. And then the last one, which is the obvious one, I guess, is the data is developing. Some of it will just be directional at the moment. It tells you where you're going, not how far you've got. And there will be, by the nature of this stuff, some things that can never be measured, and they can be really important. But things like culture, etc. How do you measure that? So, bottom line, I think data is really important. You can't get there without it, but you can't get there just with it. And you really need to prioritise what you're looking at for those that matter and those that you have to do.
And is there a question of assurance as well? So for publicly,
correct, yeah.
All right, okay. And how do we address that assurance question in terms of the reliability, completeness, etc. of this information?
It's absolutely critical. So you bang on. And anything that is either public or a material part of your strategy should be correct, accurate, complete, meaningful, etc., etc. It doesn't have to be by accounting standards at the moment, but you'd want it to be, and investors will increasingly want it to be. The problem comes if you think about what external audit does. External audit takes a set of agreed principles, checks whether management say they followed them, and then demonstrates that. Now, the problem is, of course, if you haven't got agreed principles and you haven't got agreed metrics and you haven't got agreed standards, that is not an absolute assurance process at the moment. But I think even having a system of some sort of assurance gives people comfort, not least the boards, that what you're going out with is correct and accurate as far as we can tell at this point in time of evolution, and will become increasingly more important. I think, one, it will be designed to be required over time, but two, I think this issue of greenwashing or sustainability mis-selling, whatever you want to call it, has become so high up the agenda now. If you look at in my world, the fund management world, there's a daily sheet called Insights, which is headlines. I mean, probably 3 or 4 of the 10 headlines every day are about someone greenwashing, and you ultimately have to make sure that you're not captured by that. So yes, assurance is another key part for us.
Okay, Alex, did you have any thoughts?
Yes, yeah, I think the greenwashing thing is what is very important. I mean, we're at a point where we'd rather not report something than have that issue. I think in terms of key performance indicators, we're trying to learn how to work with them. One of the challenges is, if you follow everything we've said, you would set your own ESG strategy based on your stakeholders' expectations, and then you'd put a program in place, and logically at the end of the program you'd report on how you were doing. Unfortunately, the demand from the external world kind of pulls you backwards, which is, oh, we have to report something, we better put a program together. Why have we put a program together? and so you go backwards. So I think inevitably, ideally, in an ideal world, you would set up your own key performance indicators based on what's important to you. They may not marry with what the external world wants. At the moment, that's less of an issue because the external world is not speaking with one voice. But going forward, once there's a common standard, and I know the IFRS Foundation is working on that, then it will be quite hard to deviate. You can add, but it would be quite difficult to subtract from that expectation. But if you build your own KPIs, you have to learn to live with them and understand where the data's come from and what the challenges are. And I just take a very simple example. If you're trying to measure ethnic diversity, then in some countries you can ask for it. In other countries, and it's mandatory, people have to provide it. In other countries, you can ask for it and they don't have to answer the question. So it's not just that your data is poor, it's literally that people don't have to answer the question. So you have gaps and you have to deal with that. So I think the first step is to try and understand what you want to measure, how to measure it, what are the challenges in measuring it. And then you're going to have to think about, well, how can I gain assurance over this data? And is that risk function? Is it internal audit? Is it external audit? Is it external consultant? What is the acceptable level of assurance, and for whom? Because the board may say, well, we want consultant to do it. or internal audit, but at some point a stock exchange or a regulator may say, well, actually that's not good enough.
Yeah, I think it comes back to, what caveats do you have to issue with the data to cover things like partial data, and does that then undermine the value of what you're producing? And if you're using external parties, I mean, I've not seen their engagement letters or the caveats they produce, but I'm guessing it's going to be heavily caveated at the moment. It'll improve over time, but okay.
Well, yeah, I mean, just looking at a really simple thing like your carbon intensity of your investment portfolio, the coverage, the coverage ratio in terms of how many of your invested assets can they actually report on, it is problematic. In some cases it's barely over 50%, depending on what the portfolio contains. So you can report on what you know. But it's then very hard to say, well, I'm going to link this to remuneration, because what about the other 50% of what you don't know?
Okay. Susan wants to come in. Sorry, Susan.
Yeah, I think I just the only thing I really wanted to say is to make sure that the data isn't driving the reporting. The reporting needs to drive the data, because I know what gets measured gets managed, but we don't want to just manage something just because the data is available. And it all comes back to us focusing on the things that are important to us as an organisation. And we can clutch at straws if we're getting all of these data calls. I think it comes back to the point that I made. Make sure that we're sort of giving a consistent message, and we're not letting the data drive what it is we're reporting. Just because there's loads of data out there, and data is the buzzword, data analytics, but only do the analytics if it's actually going to, I suppose, further your cause in this regard. Be focused. I suppose that's what I really wanted to add.
Okay, Keith, you looked like you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, no, it was on a different point, but that's absolutely bang on. I think it does come back to you need to define what you want and then see if there's metrics available in development. If not, rather than just going for the easy option that there's and Alex is absolutely right. You've got to be very careful what data you use, particularly for hard decisions. But it's directional on the assumption that the differences remain. If it's going upwards, you can be comfortable you're going in the right direction. But you don't do. But my point was just to reinforce this thing about the level of assurance. So we set out to try and get some independent assurance on our some of our processes, ESG processes, not because candidly we just thought it'd be good to get external assurance to verify before. And it was very interesting. We had three firms come, and one of the middle ones, which is a renowned sort of a consultancy and audit firm, rightly said the purest view is you cannot give assurance, because assurance is, as I've said, you've got to verify against standards, and therefore under certain codes they themselves at the moment can't give any really meaningful assurance. Other than sort of you do what you say you do, as opposed to you do what you say you do, and it's really good, or it's really in line with what you're supposed to do. So there is a sort of a chicken and egg here until we get the standards that Alex said. Assurance itself will be relatively limited value, because it's only really either someone's subjective view of what good is, or candidly, just sort of telling you what you want to hear.
I thought Alex made a really interesting point around partial data and then the linkage to remuneration. I'm we're probably all aware of a US NED that was heavily involved with the Risk Coalition work, and her view is remuneration drives everything. If you don't remunerate it, it's not going to happen. A bit like if you don't measure it, doesn't happen as well. So how do you work around the fact that you need to drive behaviors through or encourage behaviors through remuneration, but the data doesn't necessarily support clean measures to make that remuneration link? Any thoughts, anyone?
Well, you both things are right. Rem is a key driver of people's motivation. It may not be the only one, but it's a very strong one. So I think as we get down to different generations, they are motivated by other things rather than just necessarily cash. I think that's increasingly true. But the data has to be justifiable and used in the right way, for sure. But I think the problem comes when it becomes mechanical, so that you can't sales forces are often remunerated on set targets, fund managers as well. But when you come to these things, they've got to be an input, and if the data's not there, you've got to put it into context and directional. And is it better and reward good behaviours in a certain way and penalise bad behaviours in a certain way, but not mechanical, because it just becomes I think, as Susan said, you're not being fair or true to your consistency.
Okay.
I think the problem is that some stakeholders see remuneration as needing to be mechanical and very transparent, so that there's no suggestion that the table's being tilted after the event. So if you look at a lot of remuneration programs, they're linked to return on equity or book value per share, and that these are publicly visible and verifiable pieces of data, and the remuneration scheme has 2, 3 of these, at a push 4. What might work better is effectively for the personal scorecards and kind of targets that people have that has an influence on the remuneration to have an element around ESG. The danger is that it becomes very vanilla, in the sense that we've all seen, targets around compliance or health and safety that aren't very, biting, because they're very generic. But at the moment, we've got 20 or 30 KPIs, and if somebody said link them to remuneration, then we'd probably weight the entire deck, because there's no one killer metric that says, I've asked this of people before, if you wanted to score even just climate, what is the one metric that you're going to measure in a financial service institution? It's not scope 1 and 2. And then if it involves scope 3, nobody really knows how to measure that properly at the moment. So it becomes quite difficult. So I think we're all feeling our way, and we all know this is coming, but it's a bit of a subtle art.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we're just not there yet, and I think if you're going to link it to link ESG performance to remuneration, you need to link it to hard metrics, and I think a lot of us are, still determining what those hard metrics are. So I just don't think that we're there yet. Because there are so many things that we're trying to link to remuneration. This is just one of them, and that's probably a little bit down the road.
Okay.
Just for practical reasons.
No, that's really interesting, because if remuneration does drive things, and we're not able to actually build a good remuneration policy around ESG, then it suggests that it's going to take a little bit while longer to get ESG really motoring as it should. So it's interesting dichotomy. At this point, we wanted to open up to the audience to if they have any questions. So if you do have any questions, either put your hand up, or if you're brave enough, put your camera on. We're not too scary, hopefully. Anybody want to come in on any aspect that we've been discussing? Any thoughts, comments, questions? Oh, resounding silence at the moment. Right, that means I've got to come up with another question. Right. I think we've actually. So I was going to ask. There's a couple of some basics here, and I'm going to come to Alex because this is in your job title. The difference between sustainability and ESG, are they one and the same? Are they subtly different? What's the relationship between?
I know Keith has very strong views on this, but my perspective is I think ESG is an investment construct. It's how investment managers, shareholders, and their representatives look into an organization and look for certain measurable things. So by its nature, it's kind of checklist driven, whereas sustainability is what does it mean for your organization as part of your strategy, and it's kind of almost linked to your purpose. So it one's inside out and the other's outside in is would be my view. Unfortunately, they're getting interchangeably used.
Right, that's a helpful clarification. Thank you. And Keith, you were nodding.
Keith may or may not agree.
No, I do. I think sustainability actually, and it comes back to the thing we said earlier about what is the role of risk officer, is the long-term position of the company. And one of the factors is are all these ES and G pieces as well as other factors. So I think it is actually slightly wider, but candidly, ESG is a lens on some of those new factors that allows people to understand the position on those new factors. So I'm sort of in the same boat. I actually think my only wrinkle will be I think sustainability ultimately becomes about optimizing and maximizing long-term value for the company, and that is wider than all this stuff we're talking about today. But they are being interchanged, and there's a massive overlap. But yeah, I think now okay.
And I noticed Troy put your camera on just now. I think you were about to ask a question. So yeah, Chris, I'll bring you in.
I'll be brave and throw myself out there. It's I think this really interesting discussion on so many relevant topics, and just thinking where to dive in. Maybe on the last point around the remuneration, I wonder what the role of deferred compensation, deferred remuneration could do to help smooth that out and create an imperfect set of data points to enable there being no absolute, acquiring or removal of that incentive. But if the goal is long-term sustainability, then align that, and whether the regulators are in fact going to be expecting a similar kind of alignment. Just welcome others' views.
So Troy, thanks. I'll throw it one. I think that goes into what I've just been saying about sustainability being a wider thing of all the drivers of value. Because if you believe that long term, the things that Alex says are the typical points, earnings per share, a share value, a franchise value, it will show up in that. Now, of course, it's not a one-to-one because other things are involved, including, buyer and seller demand, all that sort of stuff. But I do think it is right. It has to go more through the long-term piece. One, because these are long-term value issues, and two, that candidly you need to hit long-term targets. You can't change it overnight, and you wouldn't want to change things overnight because it would compromise a lot of the business behaviours and activity. So yes.
I was just going to say the long-term incentives make sense. Something like book value per share, you could argue it captures it indirectly. Return on equity, maybe not. Interestingly, a lot of these remuneration schemes are set up versus peer groups, and so that's going to need some thought, because that implies that you can measure yourself and your peers using the same measures, which is inevitably going to mean you're going to have something that is recognized at least in the same sector as a metric. So I don't think we're there yet, but it's coming, and it's remuneration consultants are pushing it. I think remuneration committees are thinking about it.
I can't believe that. Surely not.
I just don't. I don't think there's a good. I don't think we have a best practice or even a practice at the moment. That's the difficulty.
No, agree.
Okay. Thank you. We're 2 minutes to 11, so I think what we'll do is we'll briefly wrap up. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists. That's actually a really interesting discussion. I learned lots. I always measure the value of a webinar on the basis of whether I've learned something, and I have. So well done all. Thanks, Troy, for being brave enough to ask a question. It was, it was a really good question as well. And I'd like to thank everyone else that has joined the call. We will be posting this discussion on the Risk Coalition website. So look out on LinkedIn and you'll see it over the next couple of days going out. As I said, unfortunately we can't edit it. So if you did come on screen, I'm afraid you are going to be on the internet. So there you go, fame at last. And
I just have one thing to say.
Yes, please, Alex.
We are going to be sitting down in the coming weeks to look at what our third topic should be.
Mm-hmm.
With a view to holding a roundtable in January, then a blog, then a webinar. So I don't think our little committee has perfect knowledge and insight. So if you've got views as to what you would want to hear about or contribute to, please contact Chris or myself or Alex Duncan, and we'll take it away.
Thank you all. That was a great discussion, and thanks, and have a good morning.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day. Cheers.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Good discussion.